Why is critical thinking disappearing in our world today? At first glance, it seems paradoxical. Never before have we had so much access to information, so many tools for learning, and so many opportunities to share knowledge. Yet, instead of becoming wiser, societies are becoming more polarized, more reactive, and, in many ways, more irrational. The rise of collective stupidity is not just a cultural concern. It is a psychological and existential one. Philosophers, psychologists, and social critics have long warned that intelligence is not the same as wisdom. To think critically is not merely to process data, but to question, to analyze, to hold competing ideas in tension without collapsing into easy answers. Critical thinking requires courage because it means standing apart from the crowd, resisting propaganda, and confronting uncomfortable truths. Noam Chomsky observed that modern systems of power thrive on distraction. Endless streams of entertainment and outrage are designed to keep us from asking deeper questions. The result is a society that feels informed, yet lacks the patience for inquiry. Information becomes noise, and noise masquerades as knowledge. Daniel Kahneman, in his research on cognitive biases, showed how the human mind often prefers shortcuts to reasoning. We rely on instinct, emotion, and tribal loyalty rather than logic. While these shortcuts were useful for survival in the past, they make us vulnerable to manipulation in the present. Politicians, advertisers, and digital platforms exploit these biases to guide behavior while convincing us we are thinking freely. Carl Sagan warned of a world where science is celebrated superficially, but misunderstood deeply. He foresaw a society dependent on technology, but unable to grasp its foundations, a perfect breeding ground for superstition and conspiracy. His baloney detection kit was a call to arms for critical thinking, yet today, fewer people seem willing to use it. Erich Fromm added another layer, noting that modern humans often flee from freedom itself. True independence of thought can feel frightening. It is easier, and sometimes comforting, to surrender judgment to authority, ideology, or the safety of the group. Collective stupidity, then, is not simply ignorance. It is a chosen escape from the burden of responsibility. The media landscape amplifies this tendency. Outrage spreads faster than reflection. Algorithms reward emotional extremes, not balanced reasoning. In such an environment, the loudest voices drown out the wisest, and silence is mistaken for consent. Socrates, centuries ago, warned against this very danger. He urged people to live the examined life, questioning not only others, but themselves. Yet today, the Socratic method is often replaced by slogans and sound bites. Instead of questioning, we repeat. Instead of thinking, we react. The disappearance of critical thinking, then, is not an accident. It is the outcome of cultural, psychological, and technological forces converging. The challenge before us is to understand these forces clearly, so that we might reclaim the power of thought before it slips away entirely. To understand why critical thinking is disappearing, we must first examine the conditions of modern life that discourage it. Critical thinking thrives on time, reflection, and dialogue, yet our world is structured around speed, distraction, and performance. Marshall McLuhan famously said, "The medium is the message." In today's digital age, the medium of communication is fast, fragmented, and addictive. Social media reduces complex issues to headlines, memes, and fleeting clips. Platforms reward attention, not depth. Immediacy, not accuracy. As a result, people learn to think in fragments. Reflection feels unnatural when every second is filled with notifications. This speed erodes patience for ambiguity. Critical thinking requires us to sit with uncertainty, to weigh evidence, to tolerate doubt. But the digital environment trains us to crave quick certainty like retweets, instant validation. Complexity becomes uncomfortable, and discomfort is avoided. The result is a culture allergic to nuance. Kahneman's work on System 1 and System 2. Thinking is crucial here. System 1 is fast, emotional, instinctive. System 2 is slow, rational, deliberate. Technology conditions us to live almost entirely in System 1. We scroll, react, and share without pausing. And because System 1 is prone to bias, error, and tribalism, collective stupidity spreads rapidly. This conditioning is reinforced by economics. Outrage is profitable. Misinformation generates clicks. Fear keeps people engaged longer than reason ever could. Media outlets, pressured to survive financially, often sacrifice truth for attention. What we consume is less journalism and more emotional manipulation. Jiddu Krishnamurti warned that true freedom comes only when we are able to observe without judgment, to look at reality without distortion. But modern culture rarely gives us the chance. From advertising to political slogans, we are bombarded with messages designed not to inform, but to persuade. The space for observation shrinks under the weight of constant persuasion. Another factor is education. Schools often prioritize conformity over inquiry, memorization over questioning. Students are rewarded for repeating answers, not for challenging assumptions. By the time they become adults, many people have learned to equate intelligence with compliance. This leaves them vulnerable to collective thinking, where deviation from the group feels dangerous. Fromm described this as the escape from freedom. To think critically is to stand alone at times, to resist the comfort of the herd. Many prefer conformity, even if it means surrendering autonomy. The rise of collective stupidity, therefore, is not just imposed from above, it is chosen from below. Because freedom of thought feels heavy, while obedience feels safe. All these forces, technology, economics, education, and psychology interlock to create an environment where critical thinking struggles to survive. It is not that people are incapable of it. It is that the culture trains them away from it. The question, then, is whether we can reverse this trend. Can individuals reclaim their ability to think critically in a world designed to discourage it? To see how collective stupidity emerges, it helps to study the psychology of crowds. Gustave in The Crowd observed that individuals and groups often abandon rationality. Once absorbed into a collective, people lose their sense of responsibility and critical distance. They feel stronger, yet think less. Jung echoed this when he said that the larger the crowd, the lower its moral and intellectual level becomes. Modern neuroscience confirms this. Studies show that conformity activates reward centers in the brain, while standing apart triggers areas associated with pain. In other words, our brains are wired to prefer belonging over truth. Critical thinking often demands isolation, but isolation feels threatening to survival instincts. Thus, even intelligent individuals may suppress doubts to avoid social rejection. Social media amplifies this tendency exponentially. Online platforms create digital crowds where opinions spread with viral speed. Algorithms elevate the loudest voices, not the wisest ones. Reinforcing herd behavior, people share articles they haven't read, repeat slogans they haven't examined, and join outrage without context. The collective amplifies emotion while suppressing reflection. Nietzsche warned of this danger when he criticized the herd morality. He argued that individuals fear standing apart, so they surrender judgment to the group. In doing so, they avoid responsibility, but also lose individuality. What emerges is collective stupidity, not the absence of intelligence, but the abdication of it. This explains why misinformation spreads so easily. It is not that people are incapable of discerning truth, but that belonging feels more urgent than accuracy. To question the group risks exclusion, while agreeing reinforces identity. Collective stupidity thrives, not because people cannot think, but because they choose not to. Carl Sagan described a similar phenomenon in his demon-haunted world. He warned of societies where superstition and pseudoscience replace rational inquiry. Without the discipline of skepticism, people fall prey to comforting illusions. Sagan offered tools like the baloney detection kit, but he also acknowledged that few are willing to use them when illusions feel safer than truth. The tragedy is that collective stupidity often masquerades as intelligence. Groups can appear united, passionate, even knowledgeable, while actually repeating shallow narratives. The louder the noise, the more convincing it seems. Yet beneath the surface, little reflection occurs. Socrates faced this in Athens when he challenged popular beliefs. For questioning the crowd, he was condemned. His story is a warning. Critical thinkers often stand alone, while collective stupidity is celebrated. The crowd does not merely resist truth, it punishes it. Understanding this dynamic is crucial. Collective stupidity is not just an intellectual failure, but a social instinct. To resist it requires more than knowledge. It requires courage. Courage to stand apart, to question, and to endure discomfort. The question becomes, how can individuals cultivate this courage in a culture that rewards conformity and punishes dissent? To resist the tide of collective stupidity, we must return to the roots of critical thinking itself. At its core, critical thinking is not about having more information. It is about cultivating the right habits of mind: curiosity, skepticism, humility, and patience. These qualities are timeless, yet increasingly rare in our fast-moving world. Curiosity is the first casualty of collective thinking. Children are naturally curious, constantly asking why. But as they grow, systems of education and authority often punish questions that challenge convention. By adulthood, many people have learned to suppress curiosity in favor of acceptance. Socrates reminded us that wisdom begins with recognizing ignorance. Curiosity, then, is not a luxury, but the foundation of thought. Skepticism is the second pillar. Carl Sagan emphasized that skepticism is not cynicism. It is openness, combined with doubt. A skeptic does not reject everything, but tests claims with evidence. In contrast, collective stupidity thrives on blind acceptance, where slogans replace arguments and feelings replace facts. Skepticism is the antidote to this intellectual laziness. Humility is equally crucial. Daniel Kahneman's research revealed how prone we are to biases, illusions, and errors. Critical thinking demands admitting that we can be wrong, yet modern culture often glorifies certainty, mistaking it for strength. In reality, certainty without reflection is arrogance. Humility, paradoxically, makes us stronger thinkers because it keeps us open to correction. Patience ties all of this together. Critical thinking requires time. Time to read deeply, to reflect, to examine assumptions. But the culture of immediacy erodes patience. Outrage travels faster than reason, and algorithms reward reaction over reflection. To think critically is to slow down in a world that speeds up. It is to resist the pressure of urgency and reclaim the space for thought. Jiddu Krishnamurti once said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." To think critically often means feeling out of place, even alienated. But this discomfort is the sign of independence. Collective stupidity thrives when people prefer comfort over truth. Critical thinking survives only when truth is valued above belonging. The challenge, then, is not simply intellectual, but moral. Do we value comfort, or do we value truth? Do we seek belonging at any cost, or do we accept solitude as the price of freedom? Erich Fromm noted that many escape from freedom into conformity. Critical thinking asks us to embrace freedom, with all its risks. Rebuilding these habits of mind is possible, but it requires deliberate practice. Every time we question instead of react, reflect instead of repeat, listen instead of shout, we weaken the hold of collective stupidity. The path is not easy, but, as history shows, truth has never been won by the majority. It has always been carried forward by the few willing to think when others refuse. Critical thinking is not just an intellectual exercise. It is an act of courage. Jung understood this when he spoke about individuation, the process of becoming whole. Individuation requires breaking free from collective illusions and confronting truths that the crowd avoids. For the empath or thinker alike, this often means walking alone. The fear of isolation is one of the strongest barriers to critical thought. Neuroscience shows that social rejection activates the same areas of the brain as physical pain. This explains why people cling to group beliefs, even when they know those beliefs are flawed. To disagree feels dangerous, almost like a threat to survival. Yet, history is full of examples where those willing to endure isolation became the seeds of progress. Galileo questioned dogma and faced persecution. Rosa Parks refused conformity and ignited change. Socrates chose death over silence. These figures remind us that critical thinking often comes at a cost, but the cost of surrendering it is far greater. A society that loses the ability to correct itself. Marshall McLuhan warned that media shapes not just what we think, but how we think. In a world dominated by images, sound bites, and instant communication, the space for depth is shrinking. This environment rewards conformity to trends, not exploration of truth. The challenge for the modern critical thinker is to carve out mental space to resist drowning in noise long enough to ask, what is real? What is true? What matters? Erich Fromm described modern humans as escaping into conformity because freedom feels too heavy. The same is true of thought. Freedom to think critically requires carrying the weight of uncertainty. Many surrender that weight to ideology, propaganda, or authority. It feels easier to obey than to question. But Nietzsche reminded us that true strength lies in self-overcoming. To think critically is to overcome not just ignorance, but the fear of standing apart. It is to say, I will not be enslaved by the crowd's approval. I will think for myself, even if it costs me belonging. This is not arrogance, it is integrity. In everyday life, this courage is tested constantly. At work, when the group nods along with a flawed idea, do you raise a question? In politics, when slogans dominate, do you investigate the facts? Online, when outrage spreads, do you pause before sharing? These moments define whether we feed collective stupidity or resist it. Critical thinking, then, is not abstract philosophy. It is a daily practice of courage, humility, and honesty. It is a willingness to lose comfort for the sake of truth. And in a world where conformity grows louder, the quiet act of questioning becomes revolutionary. Another reason critical thinking is vanishing lies in the way power structures exploit human psychology. Propaganda, as Chomsky pointed out, is not about convincing through reason, but about controlling through repetition and emotion. Say something often enough, with enough emotional charge, and people accept it as truth. Critical thinking requires breaking this spell, yet most lack the patience or courage to question the chorus. Digital platforms have perfected this method. Algorithms reward outrage, amplify confirmation bias, and create echo chambers. Each user is fed information tailored to their existing beliefs, reinforcing identity and shielding them from dissent. Over time, the ability to tolerate difference shrinks. Instead of dialogue, there is shouting. Instead of inquiry, there is certainty. Carl Sagan warned that without skepticism, societies become easy prey for superstition and manipulation. He foresaw a future where, despite technological sophistication, citizens lack the tools to distinguish sense from nonsense. Today, conspiracy theories thrive not because they are plausible, but because they satisfy emotional needs, certainty, belonging, simplicity. In this sense, collective stupidity is comforting. Critical thinking is unsettling. Krishnamurti would argue that this comfort is precisely the problem. He insisted that true intelligence arises only in freedom from conditioning. As long as we are bound by ideology, authority, or fear of exclusion, we are not truly thinking, we are repeating. To think critically is to see conditioning for what it is, and to step outside it. Yet, stepping outside is painful. It means questioning cherished beliefs, traditions, even personal identities. It may mean alienating friends, family, or communities. Jung described this confrontation as shadow work, facing the parts of reality and ourselves that we'd rather deny. For many, it is easier to stay in the warmth of the herd than to enter the cold of independence. But the cost of avoiding this path is steep. A society that abandons critical thought drifts into manipulation, division, and tyranny. Without individuals willing to question, systems of power grow unchecked. Without skepticism, lies flourish. Without courage, freedom erodes quietly, replaced by comfortable illusions. What, then, is the way forward? The answer is not mass enlightenment overnight. Rather, it begins with individuals cultivating habits of thought that resist manipulation. It means slowing down before reacting, asking questions before agreeing, and examining motives before believing. Critical thinking may never become the majority's path. History suggests it rarely does. But even a minority of clear thinkers can alter the course of culture. They act as counterweights to noise, as reminders that truth is not defined by volume. In this sense, to practice critical thinking today is to resist not only ignorance, but also the machinery designed to profit from ignorance. It is rebellion against collective stupidity, and it begins with the simplest of acts, pausing to think when others rush to react. To grasp the disappearance of critical thinking, we must also consider the role of education. Ideally, schools should cultivate curiosity, reasoning, and independence. Yet in practice, many education systems emphasize conformity, standardized testing, and rote memorization. Students are rewarded for repeating information, not for questioning it. As a result, children learn early that compliance brings success, while inquiry brings trouble. Socrates would have considered this tragic. His method, the Socratic dialogue, was built on questions that challenged assumptions. He believed the unexamined life was not worth living. But in modern classrooms, questioning authority often leads to penalties rather than praise. The seed of critical thought is discouraged before it can grow. This suppression extends into adulthood. At work, employees often avoid raising uncomfortable truths for fear of reprisal. In politics, citizens align with parties rather than scrutinize policies. In media, journalists risk alienating audiences if they challenge prevailing narratives. Everywhere, incentives push people towards silence or conformity rather than critical engagement. Marshall McLuhan observed that media not only delivers content, but shapes consciousness. In an environment of sound bites and images, attention spans shorten. Schools, instead of countering this trend, often mirror it with superficial curricula designed to keep up with speed rather than cultivate depth. Students graduate literate, but not thoughtful, credentialed, but not wise. Erich Fromm noted that many flee from freedom because responsibility is frightening. Similarly, many flee from thinking because questioning unsettles. To think critically means to take ownership of one's mind, to admit uncertainty, and to live without easy answers. Education that prizes obedience over exploration leaves people unprepared for this responsibility. But there are exceptions. Teachers who encourage debate, institutions that value philosophy, and mentors who prize questions over answers keep the flame of critical thought alive. Such environments show students that disagreement is not disrespect, and curiosity is not rebellion. They remind us that learning is not about absorbing what to think, but discovering how to think. The tragedy is that these spaces are rare, and as they shrink, collective stupidity fills the gap. When people have not been trained to think critically, they are more vulnerable to propaganda, ideology, and groupthink. The collapse of critical thinking is therefore not only a cultural issue, but an educational one. Reviving critical thought means reimagining education itself not as indoctrination, but as liberation, not as filling minds with answers, but as opening them with questions. Only then can individuals resist the gravitational pull of the herd and stand as independent thinkers in a noisy world. This is not easy, but as history reminds us, the survival of freedom depends on it. If critical thinking is vanishing, what can individuals do to reclaim it? Jung, Fromm, Sagan, and others all point to the same starting place: responsibility. Collective stupidity thrives when individuals surrender responsibility for their own minds. To reverse the tide, each person must reclaim authorship of their thinking. This begins with slowing down. In a culture that rewards instant reaction, the act of pausing is revolutionary. Before sharing a post, before joining outrage, before repeating a claim, pause. Ask, what is the evidence? Who benefits if I believe this? Why do I feel pulled to agree? That pause interrupts the machinery of manipulation. The next step is cultivating intellectual humility. Admitting we might be wrong is difficult but essential. As Kahneman showed, biases shape all human thought. Awareness of this fact makes us cautious, curious, and less vulnerable to certainty masquerading as truth. Humility is not weakness. It is the foundation of wisdom. Equally important is practicing dialogue instead of debate. Debate seeks victory. Dialogue seeks understanding. Socrates modeled dialogue as a way of testing beliefs in conversation. Today, dialogue requires listening, questioning, and resisting the urge to dominate. It is slower, less dramatic, but infinitely richer. In dialogue, collective stupidity has no oxygen. Another practice is seeking discomfort. Fromm warned that many escape into conformity because it feels safer. To think critically means leaning into discomfort, reading perspectives we dislike, questioning cherished beliefs, resisting the urge to filter reality to fit identity. Growth begins where comfort ends. Carl Sagan urged us to apply tools of skepticism in daily life, checking sources, comparing claims, testing ideas. His baloney detection kit was not just for scientists, but for everyone navigating a world of half-truths. By applying these tools, individuals build resilience against misinformation and manipulation. Finally, reclaiming critical thinking means rediscovering solitude. Krishnamurti and Nietzsche both insisted that truth often reveals itself in silence, away from the herd. Solitude allows reflection, integration, and the courage to stand apart. Without it, we are swept along by noise. With it, we find the stillness to question and the strength to resist. None of this is easy. The forces against critical thought technology, institutions, psychology are immense, but history shows that transformation rarely begins with the majority. It begins with the few willing to question when others obey, to reflect when others react, to think when others refuse. To reclaim critical thinking is therefore an act of rebellion. It is not about rejecting society, but about refusing to be ruled by its illusions. It is about standing as individuals in a world that pressures us to dissolve into the crowd. The rise of collective stupidity is real, but so is the possibility of resistance. Critical thinking is disappearing, but it is not lost. It survives wherever individuals pause, question, and resist the pull of the herd. It survives in classrooms where curiosity is nurtured, in conversations where listening outweighs shouting, and in moments of solitude where truth is faced without distraction. The rise of collective stupidity may feel overwhelming, but history reminds us it only takes a minority of thinkers to shift the course of culture. The responsibility rests with us not to wait for society to change, but to change how we engage with it. Reclaiming thought is reclaiming freedom. For without the courage to think, freedom becomes an illusion. If this message resonates, support our channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Together, we can keep alive the spirit of inquiry in a world that so often forgets it.